Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all here at today's lecture about the French philosopher Michel Foucault. My name is Lenia Slierendrecht and I work as program maker for Studium Generale at this university. And we organize lectures like today, but also workshops and many other things, as you could have seen behind me. Most of them are accessible for everyone, but sometimes only for students. Power, submission, and breaking through existing identities. French philosopher Michel Foucault wrote about our identity is connected to the power relations that affect us, such as at the university, in a family, or in a heteronormative society. How is our identity shaped by these power structures? And above all, can we break with existing identities? Marli Huijer is Emeritus Professor of Public Philosophy at Erasmus School of Philosophy and former Thinker Laureate of the Netherlands, for the Dutch people under us, the Denker des Vaderlands. And her research focuses on the philosophy of humanity and culture, and she is particularly interested in the question of how people create order. How do we organize time or our society? Give her a warm hand of applause, Professor Marli Huijer.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been working quite long for the Erasmus University, but now my main identity is that I'm out of service. I'm a professor out of service, emeritus more elegantly said. This afternoon, I'd like to talk about identities and power structures and how our identities are constituted by all the knowledge, all the power relations around us, but also how we can reflect on that and maybe change our identities or subjectivities or what you want to call it. Michel Foucault is one of my favorite philosophers, so I'm really happy to be here and to talk about him. I'd like to start with Nikki Tutorials, a makeup artist and vlogger, who in 2020 told at her YouTube channel that she was forced to tell that she is transgender, quote. What is it? Aanhalingstekens. Her surroundings forced her to tell that she was born as a boy. And she didn't want to do that. She felt like a woman and thought, why should I tell this? But because she was forced, she thought it's better that I myself tell it than someone else. It brought her a lot of fame. She even was the presenter of the Song Festival in the Netherlands. But it also had a dark side. She and her partner were molested at her house. This case raises a few questions. Is the public sharing and confiding of your identity, I'm not even sure whether it's identity, is that liberating or is it submitting to forces that are coming from others? Why is confessing something that we have to do when others say that your identity is abnormal? And abnormal can be sexually abnormal, it can be pathologically abnormal, that your physical condition is different from what others have. It can be that you look different. Everything that's abnormal is often questions. So people ask, why are you doing this or that? Who are you? And if someone is asking you, who are you, where do you find the truth? Is it in yourself or is it somewhere else? Do you need to examine yourself or is your identity constructed by everything surrounding you? And that brings me to the last question, and that's also the double side of Michel Foucault, because on the one hand, he is asking a lot of questions about this confessing of identities, but the other side is that in his later work, he is also looking at the transformative effect of speaking true. And I'll explain what the difference is later, but you know for now that there are different ways of talking about yourself. So, Michel Foucault, maybe your first question is, who is Michel Foucault? And it's the question that Foucault himself hates a lot. He doesn't want to be identified. So I decided only to tell him that he's a French philosopher and also a very proliferative writer. His books are still today best-selling books. That's incredibly important to see that his work, which is in many senses not what the dominant discourse is also very popular. Michel Foucault invites us, and this is just a summary actually of my lecture, to refuse the identities that are imposed on us for centuries. So, for example, the identity of being homosexual, being gay, is invented at the end of the 19th century. It's an identity that's very often imposed on people. And he says, I invite you to refuse these kind of identities. And it could also be the identity of being black or being a Muslim or whatever, the identity even of being a cis heteronormative person. The second thing is, that's his later work, that he asks us to reflect on who we are today. What kind of identities of relationships to yourself are possible in our time? And what were the conditions in the past that made this present possible? It could be that for you there are many identities that are self-evident, but they're self-evident in our time. And that's important to reflect on, and also to reflect on how come these identities have become self-evident, in order, and that's the last thing that he invites us to be able to transgress the limits that are imposed on what we can be today. If you really want to understand what he's saying in these invitations, it's necessary that you start with his early work. And that early work is, especially at the end of that period, is concentrated on the subject, and especially the death of the subject. Oh, shoot. Woo. Yeah. I'll first read it, otherwise you're going to read it yourself, and then I'm talking through you reading. The end of this book, this is a book of 1966, it's about his fourth book, I think. At the end of this book, and the book is called Les mots et les choses, in English, The Order of Things, an archaeology of human sciences. One of the last sentences is, as the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of recent date, and one perhaps nearing its end. One can certainly wager that man would be erased like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. This book is an analysis of the knowledge structures that are kind of subconscious. They're structures that define what is the truth, what is the knowledge that we accept as truth, also the knowledge about ourselves. And each historical period, according to Foucault, has this archaeological, subconscious knowledge structures that define what is truth, what is the truth about ourselves. And what he shows, because it's in fact an historical study of biology, economics, and linguistics, but also about the human sciences, it shows that the human sciences has made a distinction between us as subjects and us as objects. So we have become a double being able to look at itself as an object, but with an I, a subject, that can look at this object. So we are created as a specific being. Our subjectivity is created as this double being. At the end of the book, Foucault says, yeah, okay, but this was the historical period that I have studied now. It could be that this man, who is subject and object in one, will disappear. And it could be that he will be erased like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. Most of the journalists understood this last sentence as the death of man. There is no subject in the future. It's almost erased, it's disappearing. And especially Jean-Paul Sartre, in this cartoon, who, of course, placed the responsibility of the subject in the center of his thinking, was very angry and critical about Foucault. And he is asking in this cartoon, is there still anybody? So Foucault undermines the idea that we as a subject, as an I, as a person with a fixed identity, will be still the same within the coming centuries. It could be that our relationship with ourselves will completely transform in the coming times. In order to better understand that, it's good to know that Foucault analyzes 3 ways in which the subject is constituted. And the first is the way, as he did in Le Mot et les Choses, that's the subject who is constituted in knowledge systems. It's the work that he wrote in the 1960s. The second axis is how the subject becomes a subject in power relations. So how our identity is created in all the networks of power relations that surround us. And in the last axis, and that's the last work of Foucault, it's published especially in the books that appeared when in the year that he died, are about the care of the self. And what is happening then is that in the care of the self, he invites us to reflect on how our subjectivity of our identities are constituted in this axis of knowledge and in this axis of power relations. I'm going to focus on the second now and then on the third, but to give you an example of the first knowledge system, in the 1990s I did my PhD on Foucault's aesthetics of existence, so his later work, how to make your existence into a work of art. And I interviewed persons with the diagnosis AIDS, and what I tried to do related to the work of Foucault is that I tried to understand that when a physician tells you that you're HIV positive and that you're getting AIDS, your subjectivity changes from a person who is healthy into a person who expects that he or she will become ill and will die. So your subjectivity changes due to the knowledge that's imposed on you or that you yourself search. In knowledge systems, there are always positions that you as a person can take, and as soon as you take this position, you will speak certain words, you will experience yourself in certain ways, and this very often happens in a subconscious or an unconscious way. So that's the way how subjectivity is constituted in knowledge systems. Let me now elaborate a little bit more on this constitution of subjectivity in the network of power relations. In his work on knowledge, there is just words, letters, archives, and so on. It's an archaeology. But starting in the 1970s, Foucault introduces the term power. So it's not just knowledge, but it's also how we act, what norms we impose on each other. And that results in the book Surveiller et Punir. That's published in 1975. In English, it's Discipline and Punish, the Birth of the Prison. And in most books, Foucault describes a transition from the one historical period to the other historical period. And very often, this transition is a few decades. So here, for example, there's 80 years of difference. He starts in 57 with the public torture of a man who tried to kill the king. And the book opens with a very cruel scene in which the body is, there's thrown oil over it, and the meat is peeled off the person. In the end, the body is attached to 4 horses, and it's tiered in 4 pieces. So it's very cruel. And that's the public punishing that is quite normal at that moment. Also in the Netherlands, by the way. At the Dam Square in Amsterdam, there were also public tortures and killings. And for example, Rembrandt liked to go there, the painter Rembrandt, and look at all these public tortures. But then, within 80 years, you see that this punishment is completely changed. In 1837, he gives the example of a youth prison, and here you see a school, but the criminals are now disciplined. They are enclosed in prisons, and they have to be corrected and have to become normal citizens again. So that's a huge transition. And what he concludes from this transition is that the concept of power, and therefore the acting of power, has completely changed. It started with vertical power. He calls it the power of the sovereign. And that's the power that he sees in French in the ancient regime, so that's before the French Revolution. That's a hierarchical power, vertical. It's concentrated in the sovereign. The power is a personal possession of the sovereign, and it's also a personal quality. The power is spectacular. And you see here in a very beautifully clothed person. The power is also violent, with public executions and so on. It touches the body. And it's aimed at the exclusion of evil. So crime, disease, abnormality, everything has to be excluded, either by killing or by throwing people into carcels and never looking at them again. If you read Foucault, it is as if this sovereign power does not exist anymore. For a long time, I thought, well, he is right. This kind of power is disappearing, this vertical power. And fortunately, because as a Democrat, I like horizontal power. But today, if I look at what Trump is doing, I have the feeling that we're going back to this vertical power, to the sovereign whose power is concentrated in this person who is violent, like the violent acts that we have seen last week in Minneapolis. The body of so-called criminals is touched again. And Trump wants to exclude all the illegals or even legal immigrants from society. So it's repressive, it's a negative power. In Foucault, this is contrasted to a positive power. And this is the more horizontal power, a disciplinary power, which starts in the 19th century. This power is not concentrated in a person, but it's anonymous. You don't know who exactly is bringing in this power. And this power does not come from above, it's coming from all the sides. It's everywhere, and it's not a personal power, but it's a power network with a lot of techniques. And these power networks are almost invisible. So rather than being spectacular, it's more invisible. It's a permanent power. And this power is not violent. If you look at the tree that's growing, the power to make it an erect tree is not violent. It's a little bit touching, to be honest. And evil is now included. So criminals are included in society, and they need to be corrected. There is a dressage, there's a judgment, there's cure. So they need to become normal people again. And this power is productive, it's positive. And it works or functions and produces individual and collective subjects. So it produces, just like the knowledge systems, it produces specific subjects, and that are subjects that are disciplined. And the most clear example of how this works, who knows this panopticon? Many, eh? Yeah, it's very well known. So I'm not going to explain it too much. He took it from Jeremy Bentham, a British philosopher, and it's around a dome prison. There is a guard in the middle, you see that every cell contains one individual criminal, so they can't see each other. The light is coming from outside, so the guard in the middle can see the criminal, and the criminal cannot easily see the guard. And because there are kind of windows in the tower where the guard is, it's impossible for the criminal to see whether he is guarded or not. And what then happens is that the criminal internalizes the eye of the guard. So he becomes, again, subject and object, but the subject now is also an eye watching itself, whether it's behaving normal or still in a criminal way. And I want to show you one sentence in this, from Discipline and Subject. It says, a real subjection is born mechanically from a fictitious relation. En français, un assujettissement réel naît mécaniquement d'une relation fictive. And this word subjection is, of course, a double, an ambivalent term. It means that the criminal is subjected to power relations, but in this subjection, it becomes a subject, even though it is a fictitious relationship. Because even though there is maybe no guard, it's just, it's born, the whole relationship is born mechanically, it's fictitious, maybe it isn't there, it's maybe just in my mind, but this, due to this fiction and this power mechanics, I submit myself to this power relation, and in this submission, I become a subject. So, the subject, again, is both created in knowledge systems and in this kind of power relations. And in this power relations, you see that it is a very complicated relationship that we get to ourselves. We're a kind of intruded by norms from outside, by identities, by subjectivities. And one of the issues that now arises is that the criminal has to confess to this subjectivity, to this identity. And Foucault explains that better in a second book about power, and that's the book La volonté de savoir, The Will to Knowledge in English. And he shows there, you shouldn't read the text for a minute. He shows there that this power can also be related to our health and our sexuality. And at the end of this book, he develops the concept biopower, and you should have in mind this panopticon, think about this power, what it does to our looking at ourselves as an object, as something that has to be corrected, that has to behave itself normally. And this biopower, and now you can read with me, is on the one hand aimed at the human body. We have to have an as healthy as possible body, and also sexual healthy. And this first axis of power is a kind of individualizing disciplinary control. So this disciplinary power is working on the individual body, and this individualizing power makes us believe that we carry a secret within us that begs to be revealed. So here comes the confession much clearer than in his book on Discipline and Punish. It implies that um, if I limit it to sexuality, that we have to confess what we are doing in our sexuality. No, that's not right. It's better to say what we are sexual, in a sexual sense. In this book, he describes how homosexuality becomes an identity, becomes an abnormality. Homosexuality, of course, exists as long as, I should say, sexual relationships between persons of the same gender, are of the same sex, are as old as human beings are, but going away from the acts and going inside the person in order to look for the secret of being gay or being homosexual is something that is invented at the end of the 19th century. And then homosexuality becomes something that we think is someone's nature. So it's your identity, unchangeable. And you have to confess this abnormality in order for this disciplinary system to be sure that we all act in a sexual, healthy way. And that that brings me to the second axis, which is aimed at the population at large. And this population at large is discovered in this same time as something that, if you govern well the health and sexuality of your citizens, the economy of the society and the general well-being is enormously increased. So there is a relationship between this individual sexuality and the population at large, because if you govern the sexuality of individuals well, then the population flourishes more than, anyway, that's the idea behind it, than when you do not do that. And here, the confession is very important, and Foucault says this confession, this idea that you have to confess the so-called secrets in your inner self, is coming from the early Christian church, not church at that moment, but it's from the early Christian church fathers, and from the I'm forgetting the word, the cloister, the monasteries. I'll come back to that, because if you're really trying to reflect on this whole model of knowledge and power systems, and realizing that you're subjected to it all the time, and subjected in a double sense, so that even if you say, I am this or that it could be that you're not free in really deciding who you are. Maybe these power relations and these knowledge systems have decided for you who you can be. So where is the freedom to be really what you want to be? Is there any freedom? Or is everything that we say, every discourse, every act governed by knowledge and power relations? Foucault himself, many critics said to Foucault, well, there's no freedom anymore in your model. Every step that an individual takes is governed by power relations or by knowledge systems. Where's the freedom? As a philosopher, you can't believe that there is no freedom. And Foucault himself, I think, got he couldn't solve this problem, I think, and that's very normal for philosophers that they live in problems that you can't solve. But what you see is that at the end of the 70s, he is changing everything he's doing. He wanted from this book to go back to this Christian confession slowly through the centuries. But he changed his plans, and he learned Greek and Latin and delved into the medical and philosophical works of the Greek philosophers, Greek doctors, medical doctors, and Latin doctors. And after that, he still studied all the church fathers, so it's a person who worked day and night and was sitting in the books. But to show you one of the quotes in which you see that his ideas are changing is this from one Disait écrit is all the interviews that Foucault gave. And in one of the interviews, he says, "In the course of history, human beings have never ceased to construct themselves. In other words, to perpetually alter the levels of their subjectivity and constitute themselves in the manifold and infinite series of differing subjectivities that will never reach a final point and will never position us eye to eye with man." So whatever we try to do to construct the relationship to ourselves, whether it's our generation or our grandchildren, we will always change this relationship. So we will always look at a different way at our subjectivity. And whatever we do, there you can never ever find who the human being is. So instead of saying that we are fixed in all these power relations, he says, no, it's a historical transition again and again and again, in which we constitute in ever new ways this relationship to ourselves. Till what time do I have, Lenya? Okay. I have too much material, I already see. That brings me to his later work, where he delves into this concept of the care of the self. And now, in this Greek and Latin periods, so it's starting at the 5th century before the Common Era and ending at the 4th and 5th century of our era, he discovers a relationship to the self which is completely different from what he analyzed before. And that's not so strange, because there are no scientific knowledge systems. There are no sovereigns as they were there in the ancient regime. People are much more living in a physical world, in a natural environment, where real life contact is the only contact between human beings. So it's a completely different world, and he discovers there that the concept of care for the self, so the care for the relationship that we have with ourselves, that there is a whole culture of 1,000 years in which philosophers and physicians write about making life as a work of art, or trying to constitute this relation to yourself in an ethical and aesthetical way. There are different ways of caring for the self. In the beginning, it's much more Socrates who, for example, guides Alcibiades to become a leader of the city. And he says all the time to Alcibiades, you should take care of yourself. And in the first period, it's limited only to the education of the elite of the city. In the second period, the first and second century of our time, it's more broadly, the concept is more broad, and the whole, not only the elite, but the whole society is taking this idea of the care of the self serious, and especially the Stoa and the Epicureans are having a lot of writings about the culture of the self, and then it's not just this period of until the adolescence, but it's a lifelong taking care of yourself. And in the last period, it also becomes a part of the Christian asceticism, but there you see that the care of the self is transforming, and here Foucault analyzes what exactly this confession does do. A part of this care of the self is speaking true. And speaking true is a completely different concept than the truth that is brought to us or defined for us by knowledge systems. Speaking true in this, as a part of this care of the self, and these are the courses that Foucault gave about this concept of the parrhesia. Parrhesia is literally to say everything, but speaking true, which is the translation of parrhesia, is a way to create or constitute a new or a different relationship to the self. So truth, in this speaking true, is an articulation in which you manifest or constitute yourself. Foucault gives a couple of examples to make it more clear, and he also make a distinction between different types of parrhesia. The first is a personal parrhesia, but there's also a political parrhesia and a parrhesia between friends. And the personal parrhesia, and I think this is different from this confession, because confession is always aimed at a psychiater or a spiritual leader or someone who kind of obliges you to confess who you are. And here in this personal parrhesia, the example is about Creusa, and Creusa is the mother of Ian, and Creusa has been raped by the god Apollo. He left her behind in a cave. She left the cave and left the child behind, and Apollo has taken the child, brought him to a pastor, and the pastor has raised the child. But the mother does not know where her child is. So she goes to the temple of Delphi, where the god of Apollo is, and then she tells that she speaks true. And that's meant to uncover the truth about the rape of Apollo. And it's against the silence of Apollo. So it's a very courageous act to do, and it's like, for example, you can, suppose you are raped, then you can talk to a psychiatrist and confess what has happened. But here, Creusa has the courage to immediately speak to the one who has raped her. And I know from experience that it's terribly difficult to do this personal parrhesia and to really speak to the person who raped or insulted you sexuality. So this is one example. Then another type of parrhesia is the political parrhesia, and that's criticizing a more powerful person. And Foucault gives the example of Plato, who goes to the tyrant Dionysus. He is a leader of Syracuse, and he is very cruel to all the persons who he is leader of. And Plato immediately speaks to him. He says, "I'm looking for a good man. Why all this evil? Why all these cruel acts?" And Dionysius gets very angry and expels Plato, tries to let him be killed. He is not successful. Plato goes on. But this is the more political power. And if you translate that to our time, I would say, back to this powerful person, President Trump, that, for example, Jacob Frey, the mayor of Minneapolis, who said after the first killing, "Get the fuck out of Minneapolis, ICE agents." This is really courageous. It's a kind of parrhesia that you already see in Plato, trying to criticize the tyrants, or in this case, the authoritative leaders. This parrhesia, according to Foucault, is a virtue, but it's also an obligation that you feel yourself. It's not an obligation that's coming from outside. It's an obligation that you feel yourself. You feel obliged to speak true. And it's a technique, it's a certain way of dealing, and a pact. And a pact is an important word, because it's a pact with yourself. Foucault writes about this: what authenticates the fact that I tell the truth is that as subject of my conduct, I really am absolutely, integrally, and totally identical to the subject of enunciation. I am when I tell you what I tell you. Here I think we are at the heart of parrhesia. So if I am convinced for 100% that it's evil to kill innocent citizens who defend their neighbors, if I were the mayor of Minneapolis, if I'm completely convinced of that, and it's identical to what I experience as what I am, this pact with myself implies that I am courageous enough to face that if I say something like Frey said, that it could mean that my career is over. Or the pact in parrhesia is actually that you're prepared to die for what you say. So this pact is very, very intertwined with what you are. So the articulation of the truth, if you speak this truth, you manifest who you are. And as a public philosopher, I've very often seen that when I speak up, when I say something about a specific problem, or I have a political opinion, your opinion becomes what you are. I don't know if you ever experienced that, for example, between friends. You say something about a political problem, and as soon as you say that, this truth is something that you also become. So you become, for example, a person who defends Trump or whatever. That doesn't matter what it is, but you are becoming a person, a specific subjectivity. You constitute a relationship with yourself when you articulate a specific truth. The last example of this parrhesia is parrhesia in friendship. And parrhesia is opening the heart, the need for the two partners, the guide and the person being guided, to conceal nothing what they think from each other and to speak to each other. That implies that as a friend, you speak true to the other without anything hiding. You're completely open to the other. And you know that if you speak true to your friend, it could be that the friendship ends. So again, that's the pact. Rather than the anxiety that you could die from it, it's now that the friendship could end. This parrhesia continues into the Christian parrhesia. I'm going to skip this, it's too much. But what's important is that now parrhesia, so don't read it, just the last one, that in the end, parrhesia is becoming something negative. So speaking true is not valued anymore. It becomes reprehensible unless it is a form of confession. And that's telling the truth about yourself. This implies that rather than speaking true, which is connected to what you are now, this transition brings in that you now have something inside yourself. The turn to Christianity brings in the idea that the evil is in yourself, that you have to examine yourself in order to know what you are. And this transition, this turn towards the self, which is actually set in motion already in the first centuries in the antique philosophy. So it's not specific Christian, this turn to the self, but the idea that in the self there is a secret which you have to discover, which you have to examine, and subsequently have to confess to a spiritual leader, or in later centuries, to a physician, or a psychiatrist, or a judge, or whatever. That is a turn made in Christianity. And for Foucault, that's continually the question, how come we can only look at the relationship to ourselves by way of this confessing, by believing that there's something inside us? Why don't we just look at how we act? For example, in sexuality, why not just talk about the acts that you do, rather than making it an identity in which you are fixated forever? So, like in French you can say, faire l'amour, you can make love, and that's something completely different than to say, I am a person who just loves, what is it, man, women, or whatever. So this, the whole work of Foucault on this confession is his resistance against this idea that the only way to understand ourselves is by looking into our inside, discovering the evil and confessing it to another person. So that brings me back to the beginning of my lecture. I extended it a bit. So Foucault invites us to refuse the identities imposed on us. So refuse it, no self-examination. There is no secret truth to be discovered in ourselves. So there is no need to confess or for confessions or coming outs. You all know coming out is just for people who are seen as abnormal sexually. Then reflect on the subjectivities that are possible for us today in knowledge and power systems, and on the conditions that made this present subjectivities possible. And the last, try to transgress these limits imposed on us. And that implies that rather than just seeing yourself as a subject of knowledge or as a subject of power relationships, you try to discover what identities are imposed on you, how can you transgress the limits imposed by these imposed subjectivities, and where are the openings to find new relationships to yourself. And the self is always intertwined with the relationships with others. So Foucault invites us to experiment with new kind of relationships to the self. And especially by acting, for example, sexuality, you can experiment by acting, by doing things that you like to do, rather than immediately fixate yourself in an identity. And of course, by speaking true. By trying to tell the truth that is intertwined with the constitution of yourself. So, Michel Foucault now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marli Huijer, for this enlightening lecture on Michel Foucault. I can imagine there are many questions. I would start. I mentioned before that one of the things that you are interested in is the way the world or the society is ordered. What is it in Michel Foucault's thinking that appealed to you specifically in the way he tries to order society?
For me, he makes clear that all the orderings by sciences, by knowledge, by universities, that the whole world is ordered. And all these orderings impose certain relationships to ourselves. And that's, for me, quite interesting, because we're living in a world where it is as if we are autonomous and free individuals who can themselves create their lives. And Foucault throws doubts on all these ideas, shows how much we are not enforced, but seduced to speak as certain persons, to look for certain freedoms. So he brings in a completely different idea of what we are. And for me, that provides much more freedom than this idea of the free and rational individuality.
And do you think that is also the reason why it resonates so well? Like we can see here there are many people interested in him, but in current times?
There's of course a lot of critique on woke and on diversity, and Foucault is a person who stimulates us to be different, and also that today is different from yesterday, and that the future might bring a lot of new differences. So difference is very important in his work, rather than that you fixate yourself in one identity. And if you look at the whole comment on identity politics, then the critique is that we are kind of standing on our identity and demanding a lot because of our identity, whereas I would say, from the perspective of Foucault, people are asking to be able to constitute their lives in a way that is different from what is imposed on them. And there are, for example, if you take the women's movement of the 1970s, all the identities imposed on women were questioned, because women felt we want completely different lives. And how can we do that? How can we organize ourselves? And then the gay movement also started from the idea we have an identity and we organize ourselves around that identity. But after a few decades, they felt like, why should we still be coming out? Why? Why are we abnormal? Why are we different from the hetero world? And all this question from a lot of people to be able to constitute their own lives in the ways that they themselves want to do that is, I think, what makes it urgent forever.
Are there questions from the audience? Then my colleague David comes to you. There's a guy in the middle of the room, actually.
Thank you. So my question would be regarding Foucault's emancipation potential. Since he didn't believe in a human nature, he believed that the subject is solely a product of discourse and of power systems.
Yeah.
Really, to who is he addressing? Because since there is no subject preceding a power, and we are solely a creation of a power system, we can't liberate ourselves because we don't exist prior to the system. We are creations of the system.
Yeah.
So to who is he addressing? And doesn't that make himself and his critical project also a product of the same power system? It seems to be no escape.
Yeah, yeah. These are the paradoxes that are part of his work. The question, to whom is he calling if there's no subject, is one of the questions that's very often raised in Foucault circles. You might solve it, and I would say that Foucault himself does that also, by explaining that we are a kind of we are living in a world where a lot of power relations are. Power relations meet each other, and we are, as a subject, a kind of concentration of these power relations. And that's a temporal constitution, but it implies that if something is happening and coming into this constellation, it will respond in a certain way. But we have, of course, our ability to reflect on what this constellation is, what is coming to us, and how we respond to it. That doesn't mean that there's something above the subject and that the reflection is something that saves us from this unfreedom. No, I would say the bottom line is that there is no free subject, no subject as such, a big thing that you can appeal to. But since all of us are part of the discourses that we speak, part of this power network, and there is a concentration of all these forces where you can say, for the moment, this is my I, and I try to make that I as moral, as aesthetic, and so on. And here Foucault leans on the work of Nietzsche, who also says that there are forces working on us, through us, there are internal forces, and in this constellation of forces, at a certain moment, we say, well, this is who I am, and this is how I respond. But to be honest, I always found this a very difficult philosophical problem.
There's another question a little bit up there.
Thank you for the seminar. My name is Ahmed, and I have a question about the different identities. I believe humans do need identities, but you can change them. But ultimately, just like people need clothes, ultimately you need an identity. But also part of why politics is so messy nowadays is, would you say it's correct? It's because people transfer the meaning of life and all kinds of big questions upon the political stage, since all other identities have been devalued a bit, from patriotism to family values to religion.
What is your question?
Yeah, so if that my idea is correct, since politics is so volatile nowadays because of the degradation of the others.
I'm not completely sure.
So maybe polarization, you mean? Or
Yeah, why
polarized?
politics is so polarized.
Yeah.
Your first thing is that you say we need identities.
Yes, correct. Okay, let me
I'm not sure whether. No, let me start with polarization. Polarization is that you constitute two collectives, two closed collectives, and there are so the normal contradictions in society are constituted as two poles, two closed collectives that oppose each other, and the trouble with polarization is that all the differences between the poles are taken away. And if I identify with one collective, for example, the collective the Netherlands, and we are against, say, something, the Germans, the French, or whatever, then it's a model for war. And I would say, rather than thinking in opposite binaries, it's much more productive to think in plurality, in very different positions, where you again and again ally to certain persons, always temporal, or not always, it doesn't need to be temporal, but it can be temporal. And then you have a model which is different from the identity politics, which very often brings you in opposition with another identity.
Thank you.
There's a question a few rows down. Yeah.
Hello, thank you for the lecture. It was very interesting. I guess I do agree that identities are not real, then they can change at any moment.
Yeah.
However, I'm not sure about the part of no self-examination and having to find no secret truth in the slide.
Yeah.
Because if our identities exist in us as a constellation, then we have to critique our own constellation in order to create some other new behavior. But the problem is that all our identities were created in the relationship of power structures that we have experienced in real life. So how do we create or critique our current constellation without self-examination? And how do we properly self-examine other people's constellations?
Yeah. Suppose we were, as human beings, free acting beings, without any marks or identities on it. And I would meet another person, and we act in a certain way to each other. I would say that's the ultimate freedom. That's free moving individuals who see where they end. And this free human being would make connections with different others in different ways and constitute different friendships, relationships, and so on. And that non-existing freedom is, I would say, what Foucault, in the end, is looking for, trying to find ways of acting that are not given in by by everything that's working on you, but that exists kind of outside of all this power and knowledge structures. And that's an almost impossible thing to do, because we do live in a world with all this knowledge and power and so on. So you could say that the whole exercise of Foucault, from going back to the Greeks, to a time where this power and knowledge systems did not exist, doesn't make sense in our time, because we are fixated in all these subjectivities. And we are so very much convinced that what we are is to be found in our interior, the secrets in our interior, that it's almost impossible to transgress this idea and to find new ways of constituting yourself. So I would say I take the work of Foucault as an inspiration to look in the present, how am I constituted, and what maybe minimal openings are there to find different ways of connecting to other people or connecting to myself. Is that an answer?
Can she maybe have the microphone back for a minute?
Thank you. Yes, I just want to ask a follow-up. So you are saying that by looking at ourselves, we can try to find a different way to relate to each other and ourselves.
Yeah.
So that would imply that there is another level or type of self that is beyond what Foucault is talking about, that exists like outside of the constructed self in relation to all the power structures.
Yeah.
Correct?
But there is never an essence. There's no essential self. Each relationship to what we call self is a product of the ways that we act and we speak.
Okay. So if we are to look for a new way to relate with each other, we cannot look at ourselves. We need to find a different source. Does he suggest any sources that we should look into?
Yeah, one of the things that he describes in the 1980s is friendships between men, which are not sexual or whatever, but creating relationships between men that are there are real connections, like almost a sexual relationship, but then as friends. And this he contrasts to the army, where if you're gay, you're not allowed to be in the army in the USA. And I'm not sure whether that's still valid today. I think they changed it. But he wants to explore and experiment with relations with men that are not formed by this identity of being gay or not being gay or whatever. So it's really an exploration of how can you create relations that are different from what we know.
There was another question. Delia.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to bring the conversation back to the political sphere.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about what you said about speaking true, or what Foucault has to say about speaking true. And I'm interested in your reflections on how this speaking true seems so familiar to us from the far right, radical far right political circles. And I'm thinking here about the emotional speak, which we can often see in these far right politicians, where the authenticity of their emotions seems to be very real. They speak from the heart, from the inner truth. They also criticize powerful persons, the so-called status quo, the power elites, the media elites, and so on and so forth. So I'm feeling very ambivalent because I can recognize the conversation that Foucault launches around the speaking true also as a form of resistance, of recovering some sort of agency.
Yeah.
But how am I to think about it in a context where precisely this speaking true has become a sort of a marker of the radical far right? And we can all think about specific politicians. They may be female politicians, they may be even perhaps gay politicians, I don't have a clear example here, who use this very emotional, personal experience to connect and they seem to be speaking truth to power. They seem to be criticizing the powerful.
Yeah.
What do you think? How do we make sense of this? So just
Yeah.
give us a bit of your reflection on this.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can really give a good answer to it. There are many critics of Foucault, for example, Michael Walzer, who say that he is a young conservative. Well, he doesn't live anymore, but when he wrote this, he is a Nietzschean young conservative, and this is something for the elite. And I think you're right that the speaking up of far-right persons looks like the speaking true that Foucault brings in. But Foucault makes a difference between speaking true in the sense of that what you say, that you say everything that's in your mind and you do not reflect and just throw your opinions in the public domain, or as an obligation that is that has an intention to do something for the world. For example, the parrhesia of the cynics is aimed at transforming the world. The cynics are the philosophers who hate richness, who want to live a sober life. They want to transform the world because it's much more important that we are good persons than to be rich or wealthy persons. And they use parrhesia especially as an obligation, as a virtue, in order, as a philosopher, to change the world, to make it a better world. And that implies that especially the cynics use this technique, and you're right, everyone can use this technique. They use this technique in order to make the better world and to be involved with all other persons, with the whole community, the whole city, and try to help it flourish. That doesn't prevent us from that you can use this parrhesia also in a very, provocative way, and do as if it is really a pact with yourself and so on. So it's a trick, it's a fine line between Foucault speaking true and this far right speaking true. Yeah.
From the corner of my eye, I thought, so in the same line. And then you.
Yes. I understood your last point of transgression as a way to actualize a sort of freedom and a resistance to the power structures.
Yeah.
But it sounds also really individual as a practice of resistance. And I'm wondering whether there is a space for collective resistance in Foucault's framework.
There are texts in which is more collective. For example, Subject and the Power, which is the afterword of a book that two American philosophers wrote with Foucault and about Foucault. And in this Subject and Power, he talks, for example, about the women's movement as a movement where this resistance to identities is a collective movement. It's also a transversal movement. It's taking all many agents everywhere in the world as part of this movement. So there are some examples where he more clearly see struggles that are collective, and he also, but it's a difficult example. He went to Iran at the end of the 1970s and was very much impressed by the collective will of the population to resist the Tsar. He didn't, of course, know that the new religious leaders would bring in a new authoritarian regime, but he was very much impressed by this whole movement, this whole collective that resisted the authoritarian power. So there are some examples of collective struggle in his work, but to be honest, it's quite rare. And he very often says, well, the I is always related to the other, but it's if you have a way of reading that does not sympathize with Foucault, you can easily say that it's too individualistic. Yeah. The trouble is, of course, that if you think about the relationship of yourself to yourself, it is something that is happening within the subject.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for your lecture. My question was, so you suggested that we might be seeing another shift from a society where the aim is to correct those that we find abnormal or evil, to correct them and to fix them, so to speak. But we might be seeing a shift back to a society where we aim to destroy those that we deem abnormal or evil. Is there perhaps an answer in Foucault as to why the shift is happening again? So, or perhaps a parallel between the current shift that we're seeing and the original shift from yeah.
Yeah, Foucault is everything but an utopian thinker. So if you, as a kind of philosopher historian, look at the historical transitions, you can't expect him to think that if there is a new transition that it will bring something good. And if he would live now, he probably would say, well, this whole new authoritarian movement, the backlash that the feminist struggles has given today, that's also a historical transition, and it could be that we again go from a vertical power concept back to a horizontal, and now back again to a vertical power. So there's just history for Foucault.
I'm sorry, would you say it's a shift backwards or something entirely new this time around?
It's always new. Yeah, it's always different again, but yeah, there's no guarantee at all that it will be better than what we had. So it's a continuous shift of historical periods.
That was it for today. Thank you all very much for being here. Can I have one more hand of warm applause for Marli Huijer? I saw some more hands raised, but come up to the front and ask your question here in person. That is no problem.
That's okay.
And have a good evening, all of you. And see you at one of our other Studium Generale programs.